Hi, here I am. I apologize for the confusion. There were there were three waiting previously. I guess there's at least one of you that's here watching. So again, I apologize for the delay. I think we're up and running. So welcome. We're just going to talk about research in Hell's Kitchen, which is a neighborhood also known as Clinton in Manhattan in New York City. And seems to be quite a popular topic on the New York City genealogy group on Facebook that I participate in. And the important thing is that, search for knowns to unknowns, and hopefully tonight we'll talk about, what we all know from our life experience, those of us who may have grown up or live or continue to live in New York City and know the neighborhood. Traditionally, it was known as an Irish immigrant area. My great grandparents moved there in the late 1880s, probably about 1889. Their son was born in July of 1890 there, and they lived there both the rest of their lives for 7 more years for the husband and for 21 years for his widow, who would remarry at Holy Cross and have a son with her second husband. She also had a few more children in 1892, 94, 96 with her first husband. Um, but taking that information and trying to um, get it to expand. What do you know, and go from there. Um, the I had posted some books. I have a map here that I've laminated, so I apologize for the reflection. But this is, the most of the part of Hell's Kitchen. Years ago, I was having a very difficult time finding parish records. Now that the records are up on Find My Past, it's much easier. But for Catholic parish records, there are only a few that were filmed for the Family History Library through the Utah Genealogy Association. And one of them, fortunately, was St. Raphael's, which is a Hell's Kitchen parish, but it doesn't begin until 1886. And that's when it was founded, and its records started in September of that year. And if you had any events before then most likely they took place at Holy Cross or St. Michael's, and they had to write a letter and hope that the secretary was able to find it, or was not too busy, or was interested, or you gave a fair donation. But it was so hit or miss trying to get answers and try to know based on where the family lived. um, did they have did they have the did you have the correct addresses? The research, again, starting with knowns to unknowns. Probably the best thing to start with is the United States Census. It's taken every 10 years, so the families generally do show up every 10 years. You get a snapshot, and they change. You go from being a child to a young adult to a married adult to a parent to an older parent to an empty nester potentially, or you're living in the home of a child or someone else, and then an older person, and then you die. So most people are going to be anywhere from 5 to 8 census records. Maybe only one if they come as an adult, and they die quickly after they emigrate. They may not be very many census records, but that gives you an idea of the general framework of the family. Who's the husband, who's the wife, how many children. Those questions in 1900 of the women, how many children born, how many living. They're not absolutely gold standard, but they are very helpful and very useful information. And then working from that, you're able to hopefully follow up and find birth and death records. If the family says that there were 7 children born and 5 living, and they moved, um, and they've been married 20 years, and they moved in 1878 to the United States. So that would mean all the children should have been born in the United States. Can you track down the birth record if it was ever created, or the baptismal record if they were Christian and practiced infant baptism? Hell's Kitchen again is predominantly Irish, but it's not. I'm sure there were some people who were not of Irish extraction, and Irish people can be both Catholic or Protestant. And that's something that I have found in that neighborhood in particular. Is a lot of fluidity where when people were divorced or married, had mixed marriages, they may not, strictly follow Catholic canonical rules, and you'll find them appearing as godparents and as spouses in Protestant church records. So you need to be open to that just because your family is Irish Catholic doesn't mean that they're never going to appear in Protestant records. Just because your family's Protestant generally doesn't mean that they might not appear in a Catholic record. They may have had a Catholic marriage with a subsequent or earlier spouse that you're unaware of. Your family may have started out Protestant and then converted to Catholicism, or started out Catholic and converted to Protestantism. But I have been very surprised to see the number of times that the people show up in the records with the I think the anecdotal evidence that people are aware of would be that Catholics and Protestants didn't mix. That before Vatican II, there was great divide, and there was very little interaction. But clearly, if you've been to Times Square area there, to go to the theater or for other reasons, during the day, during the evening, it's very crowded. So I'm sure that hasn't changed. When you go to Calvary Cemetery, you'll be amazed at just how many headstones there are, and you have to remember that those graves probably hold up to 6 people per grave, so they keep digging down. They dig down real deep the first time, and then they come up, but there's going to be several burials in a grave, and they're not side to side as in less populated areas of the country. So those people lived somewhere, and then when they die, they have to be buried somewhere. So obviously they ran out of room relatively quickly in Manhattan, and they would take a ferry service over to Queens if they were buried in Calvary. There's also quite a few cemeteries in Holy Cross, for example, in Brooklyn. But then to remember that there's several Protestant cemeteries, now it's called All Faiths, but originally it was called Lutheran, and then also Greenwood. For 2 examples, I've seen quite a few burials in those cemeteries. So that would be an all-day event that you'd have the funeral service at the church, and then have to transport the body from the west side over to the east side, and then get on the ferry, take the ferry from Manhattan over to Queens, and then from the dock to Calvary, and then for the burial, and then return home to Manhattan. So it would definitely be quite an ordeal, even though today it would be traffic that would keep you slowing, but that would have been quite a deal. And that's something I encourage people to think about, is that we can walk the space that our ancestors lived in and walked in, and that hasn't changed. Some of those buildings are the buildings that were there when the walk-up apartments, the 4-story buildings, that's what was there 100, 150 years ago. So you can have a very good idea of what life was like to come out of that building, walk to the grocery store, walk to church, walk to your job. I come upon several butchers, several slaughterhouses in the area. The map shows, that's a fire map. So they show you exactly what is there on the ground. And then, get the idea of, when they lived in this apartment, would they have gone to St. Raphael's, or might they have gone to Holy Cross, or might they have gone to St. Ambrose or somewhere else? What Protestant churches are there, and how close were they to a home? And be flexible, with that. And then also the city directory gives you like the census gives you a snapshot of a family every 10 years. The city directory gives you hopefully a shot of the family, at least the head of the household, generally the man. And then if he died, the widow would be listed, with his name in parentheses. So you're confident you have the right family. and they moved a lot. My godmother died early this year. She was 98, but she's been a great resource over the last several decades as I've done this. And she said that they like to move every year to get a freshly painted apartment, and it also at times there would be more apartments than people, and to get new tenants, or to entice new tenants to leave their current abode and to come to be in your building, you would offer them, a free month's rent, and then or a freshly painted apartment, possibly both. So they do move quite a bit, and that's where using the cross-referencing records from the do they show up in a birth, death, or marriage record? Generally that record will ask their address. If the husband was American born or a naturalized citizen, did he vote? He had to register to vote every year, so that address would be printed in the newspaper in a special supplement of the city record, which is a courthouse record, not the New York Times or the Daily News. Not a you know um, general newspaper, but a specialized court newspaper called the city record. And that also has other information. If your ancestor worked for the city, their name would be in there, how much their wage was, if they're a teacher, what's their salary. But that city record gives you, by assembly district and electoral division, every man who registered to vote that year, and you can track that. And then the census, for example, the 1890 federal census was taken just a few weeks ago in 1890 on June 2nd. It started. Well, that was lost in a fire in the early 1920s. And it wasn't so much the fire that destroyed it, but the water to put the flames out destroyed the paper that the census had been written on. So in 1933, I believe it was an act of Congress to destroy, what had formerly been, the census. And it took an act of Congress to do exactly that. And the so in 1890, the census, the city was not happy with its count. And in 1870, they complained along with Philadelphia and Chicago. Well, Philadelphia and New York were allowed to have a second census in 1870. In 1890, New York was told no. And remember, in 1890, New York City at that time does not include Brooklyn and Queens. It's just Manhattan and a part of the Bronx were considered New York City. And the police went out for 3 weeks at the very end of September and the very beginning of October, and they did, a quick head count, the name of the person, their sex, and their age. You don't know how they're related. Like my great grandfather's living with his sister, so she could have been his wife. They have the same last name, but I know that wasn't his wife. That was his sister. But the record doesn't make that clear. But you could find a person, and it's been helpful because not all of the 1890 police census survives. But if you know where the family had a baby that month, or the husband voted, like I have another family, I know I'm never going to find them in the 1890 police census. And the reason I hadn't been able to find them in a different part of the city was because that book has been lost. So unless that book turns up somewhere, it's tucked away in the wrong place in an archive. But I know for certain that I'm not going to find it. And then another time, I know that the gentleman registered to vote, and I went to the census to look, and all the other people who were registered to vote in that building are there, but he's not. So I don't know, the story of why he's there to vote, but he wasn't there for census day. Maybe, he was in the hospital. He was staying somewhere else. He eventually, years later, fell off a wagon drunk. So maybe he had a blackout period, and it just happened to be the same day. Or maybe he was, leery of the police. I can imagine, that would never happen today. The idea of the New York City Police Department going out and taking a census, and it wouldn't matter if it was Donald Trump's idea or Bill de Blasio's idea. That would be, that just wouldn't happen. But in 1890, it did happen. So for genealogists, we have a terrific census substitute to replace, an otherwise, completely lost for Hell's Kitchen census record. I have some books here that I apologize for reaching in. I've listed them, but I'll show them. the New York City Municipal Archives. Apologize that it's backwards, but Aaron Goodwin is on the Facebook group, and he's written this book, and it's very good, giving you a detail of what records are at New York Archives, Municipal Archives. This is a finding aid for the 1890 census, which has kind of been superseded by the digitization, and you can search it through Family Search. But this gives you an idea of what books were lost and where each address, where it should show up. New York had multiple censuses. So there is an 1855 census for Manhattan. The subsequent ones before 1890 or 1905 rather, have been lost, or no one knows where they are, which is really sad because there were two records. There was one that was kept locally and one was sent to Albany. So it's very odd that both, I believe 1865, 75, and 1892 for Manhattan were lost, but apparently they were. And then Estelle, Guzik, while Hell's Kitchen may be a heavily Irish area and not very many Jewish Irish people, but obviously this book is going to talk about vital records and naturalization and city directories and the city record, etc. Those records are going to be the same regardless of somebody's faith. You could be an atheist, you could be a Jew, you could be a Christian, but the naturalization process, the census record, etc., are going to be the same. It also has some specifically Jewish records, but that was a great resource. My Family History Center had that book years ago, and I bought the original, and then it was updated. Here's an interesting book. A lot of topics online at Family at Facebook are a group. There's a lot of people that can't find birth certificates. So this is a history of childbirth from 1750 to 1950, brought to bed childbearing in America. Judith Walker Walzer, Levitt is the author. And what she writes about is how childbirth was very much a female endeavor, as one would imagine. Obviously, the main person in the room is the expectant mother. And ideally, what she wanted was a group of women that she was comfortable with and could support her through the birthing process. And ideally, they were women who had done two things. They had previously assisted at a birth, and more helpful probably would be that previously she had delivered a child herself. So between the two mothers, the sisters, sister-in-laws, good friends, neighbors, etc., you have a group of anywhere 5 to a dozen women who, if things go wrong, they have a life experience of, okay, when that happens, 10 years ago with another birth I was at, this is what we did and things went very wrong. So let's not do that. Or things, we were able to save both the mother and the child. Childbirth was a very risky endeavor. And just because a woman survived her first childbirth didn't mean that the second, the seventh, or the 10th might not be the one that does her in. Obviously, the woman delivering her 10th child is no longer 18. So, her age may be have become an issue. So as the 19th century progressed, when things went south, they would rush to get the doctor, and the doctor had the thankless job of basically coming in and trying to rescue a ship that had already passed the point of no return, and he wasn't going to be able to save the mother and the baby, or either of them potentially. So one of the reasons why you might not have birth certificates could be that for quite a while, and even well into the 20th century, there wasn't necessarily a doctor. And just because there's a doctor doesn't mean that he registered the birth. And yes, there may have been a few female doctors as well. I don't mean to say that there weren't, but generally speaking, it was very traumatic to have a man come into a very female environment, because even the father of the child, the husband, wasn't at the birth. It was, his mother, his sister, his mother-in-law, his sister-in-laws, etc. So that book was a very interesting read, and it talks about how, then the doctor wanted to be coming in to the birth sooner. That way, if there were problems, he could, do things quicker and salvage a situation before things got out of hand. But if more than likely, if there isn't a birth certificate, you have to be open to the very strong likelihood that if there wasn't anything wrong with the delivery, that the child was born and the midwife, didn't necessarily report the birth to the city, and therefore the only record of birth will be an infant baptism, and that record may or may not have a date of birth. It'll have a date of the christening, but it won't necessarily have a date of birth. Guide to Genealogical and Biographical Sources for New York City, Manhattan by Rosalie Fellows Bailey. Now, this is an older booklet from 1783 to 1898, so she just covers up to the time when the current 5-borough system was incorporated. But it does give details about some things about, the death records and permits transferring bodies, through the city. This book was recent published, I believe it was published last year. It's on tracing immigrants through the port of New York, early national period to 1924 by Anne Siebert Buiter. I hope that's how you pronounce it, but I sent her an email and let her know what a terrific job she had done, and she was very flattered and sent a nice response. But this book was published by the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society, and it's a very, very, very detailed record of how the passenger lists were created, what records were created. There apparently were state records, which apparently have been lost, unfortunately. And then lastly, this book, Finding Your Irish Ancestors in New York City by Joseph Buggy. Now, it's not the biggest, but it does give quite a nice overview and does give some specific information. And books, as I've told people over the years, no editor is going to publish a book that doesn't have information that hasn't been printed before. There has to be something new. So I generally find that, look at the book at the bookstore. If you still go to the library, take advantage of that. Hopefully your librarian has a budget that she's buying up-to-date books, and you can borrow it and see, and that's a nice birthday or Father's Day gift. If you've looked at the book at the library and you want your own copy, that you don't have to keep going back to the library to borrow it for a few more weeks. You already have it on hand. But my experience has been that you do find books that are going to give some new detail that you're unaware of. Years ago, when I first started this, I was at a historic cemetery in my town where some of my mother-in-law's relatives were buried, and I ran into another researcher, and she asked me if I had been to the Mormons yet. And I said, well, I'm Catholic. Why would I go to the Mormons? And she said, you're Catholic, but you may have a third cousin that's become a Latter-day Saint. And, family history is part of their belief system, and they've filmed, original records the world over, and they're available to you through Salt Lake City for a nominal fee. And you need to go look, and I was amazed at what I learned back then with the the CD-ROMs. You had they were in a cartridge, and you put the cartridge in the computer, you take it out if you needed the next set. But the International Genealogical Index was extremely helpful in my research, and I wouldn't have known that had I not run or it would have taken me quite a while longer if I hadn't run into a woman. And then years later, I had an acquaintance who was a man originally from Brooklyn that was living out in the Midwest, and he was very concerned as a Jewish man that he didn't want go to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and to do research. And then the next thing he knows, he's got missionaries at the door trying to convert him. And I promised him, I said, oh, they don't do that. I said, if you go there Tuesday and the missionaries are there a week later, it really is a coincidence. They were going to be there a week later regardless. And he was a little leery. It took him a while, but then he did go, and then he became a big advocate of he was able to access a lot of these records that now are becoming more and more available online. But back 15 years ago, 20 plus years ago, they were only available, you know, either going directly to the locality or getting them through Salt Lake City. So that's the important thing. And I guess, are there any questions? If you want to type, or comments, I'd love to, this is the very first time I've done this, so I apologize. There's no way to, have other people on. I've seen live streams. There must be more advanced software. I'd love to, get some of the, there's a few people on Facebook, on our message board that do a terrific job with their answers. I'd love to, either interview them and ask some questions, or, have an open panel and have people, type in questions, and then, have that person, if he or she were willing to join us, we could have, 4 or 5 picture windows up, and, you could see, that man or woman, and take advantage of their expertise. I certainly don't know everything. And I certainly am always, open to, hearing other people, but I learn from doing, and I suggest that for other people. Again, working from knowns to unknowns. What do you know? You know that, as I mentioned, at Calvary Cemetery, there's 6 people in a grave. Well, the likelihood of just an anonymous stranger appearing in a grave with 5 family members is very unlikely. So that person is related to the other 5 people somehow. It's an in-law, or at worst, or at most distant, it would be some sort of neighbor who just, died and didn't have the money, and they took an act of charity, and they were buried in that grave. But if you look hard enough, you can find that, look at the death certificate. Who are this person's parents? Look at the birth certificate. Is the name of the parents recorded correctly? And then you'll find that where the connection is. Oh, this is a nephew, or this is a brother-in-law. This is a stepfather. With my Hell's Kitchen, I had a brother of a great grandfather who had 2 sons that had godfathers named Goodwin, and I didn't know who they were. And I slowly but surely figured out, they were baptized in 1891 and 1892. The 1890 census was not helpful at that time because it wasn't available. And then the police census wasn't easily searchable, and I didn't know who I was looking for. But in 1880, the federal census was searchable. So I looked on Ancestry and found that there was a family of Hugh and Ellen Goodwin, and they had a son named Owen and another man named Owen Goodwin. So both of them could have been the Owen Goodwin godfather from 1891. And they had a 3-year-old son named Peter, who could have been the godfather in 1892, because he'd be 12 years older and he'd be 15, which would have been old enough. And, it was a painstaking effort. The head of the household was Hugh Goodwin. It didn't identify how he was related to Owen Goodwin, the older Owen Goodwin. I believe they're brothers, but I still haven't proved that. I don't think I ever will prove that. Owen did marry and have 1 child, but she died as an infant, so she obviously has no issue. There's not going to be a DNA connection from him or her. I'd have to dig them up. I don't know. Obviously, I don't have any legal right to do that. I don't know that it would really work, and I don't know that, I'm really that interested. Maybe I'll get lucky and there's some other newspaper article or something that'll make reference. He's the gentleman that fell off the wagon intoxicated, so I'm sure he had other connections with the law. So maybe there'd be court record I'll find at some point that'll connect him. But Hugh Goodwin had a marriage record that said his parents were Patrick Goodwin and Catherine Rogers. And my great-grandfather and his brother were the son of Patrick Goodwin and Catherine Goodwin. I didn't know her maiden name. And just because, they're all 3 of them are sons of a man named Patrick and a woman named Catherine, doesn't mean that my ancestor and his brother weren't descended from Catherine, somebody other than Rogers Goodwin. So Hugh Goodwin was buried in a grave of purchased at Calvary by a man named Martin English in 1901. And I was like, well, why isn't he buried in the grave with his wife and his children? And, a lot of literally years of research, going down this rabbit hole, trying to figure it out. And, I found that his wife had been married previously, and that the two older children, Margaret and Owen, even though they were listed as Goodwin in 1880, they were not his children. They were actually Rafferty. And I was able to find Margaret Rafferty as a widow in 1870 with Margaret and Owen, 10 years younger. And her husband and her fifth infant had died in the census year, so they were in the mortality schedule of 1870. So this family did give me the ability to use a lot of records that my family doesn't appear in. And even though they were married in the Catholic Church, they did have a civil marriage record. And in 1872, when they married, the certificate was issued or turned into the city. And apparently the procedure at that time was for the clerk to take the certificate, write down the information in a 2-page ledger style entry, the one line across the 2 pages of all the details, the name of the bride, her age, the husband's, the groom's name, his age, the address, who was the official, and then the certificate, I believe, was supposedly sent to Albany, and then the ledger was kept locally. So that was the practice from 1866 to about 1887, 88. I think 88, there's an index, but no records. And 1887 is the last year with the actual ledger. So that told me, who they, and that they were married at St. Michael's, I was able to figure out. And then St. Michael's, of course, in Catholic Church records in that period don't give you a lot of information. So it didn't make any connection. They would go on to have 3 children together. So Ellen bore 8 total children, 5 with John Rafferty, her husband, who she married in Hell's Kitchen at Holy Cross in 1861. They had a daughter who lived a year from 1862 to 63, and she drowned. And then they had a second daughter who lived to 1920. She has living issue. And then they had a son who died in his young adulthood in the 1890s. He has no issue. They had another little girl who lived a short time, and then a little boy who lived a short time. And then they had the Goodwins had a son who lived 2 years, and then they had a son and a daughter who both married. Only the daughter had children. And but the son was the Peter Goodwin, most likely from the baptismal registry from 1892 in Holy Cross. So I was able to, put that, and I can find them living in the same vicinity. I could find Hugh obviously lived with Owen in 1880. Peter, who was my great-grandfather's brother, lived with Owen in the same building at least. I don't know that they were in the same apartment, but they certainly were in the same building. And then John also, who was my great-grandfather, he lived in the same vicinity as all 3 of these other Goodwin men, and one of whom I know is his biological brother, his full brother. And, at the St. Paul the Apostle in 1890, Peter Goodwin married his wife, Mary Cunningham. That took me forever to find. It wasn't until those marriage records became available through Find My Past, the Catholic records, through their Catholic Heritage Archive. And it did identify who their parents were, because just like there's not necessarily a birth certificate, it was very common for, the Catholic churches. So that's going to be, the Irish of Hell's Kitchen that were Catholic, quite a few of them, although some Protestant marriages were also missed. They were not turned into the civil authorities like they were supposed to be. But the civil record is nice because in New York, it asks who the father and mother were. Not every state does, even well into the 20th century. If the couple were of age, then they had no reason, I guess, to ask who the parents were, so they didn't. So states like Arkansas or Missouri, you find out that John Brown married Mary Smith, and that's it. Whereas at least if Mary Smith were underage, she'd have to get parental consent, so you'd get find out who her father, her widowed mother, what their name was. So in 1890, it said that Peter Goodwin was the son of Patrick Goodwin, which I knew, and Catherine, which I also knew, but it gave Catherine's maiden name, thankfully, and it was Catherine Rogers. So for 10 years, I've been searching, and my hunch was right, that Hugh Goodwin, even though he was born in 1842 and was a full 18 years older than my great-grandfather, that my great-grandfather was his full brother, not a half-brother, and I didn't think they could be cousins because they were both sons of Patrick, or at least not first cousins. That's why, hi, I'm Larry, and this is my brother Daryl, this is my other brother Daryl. That's why it's funny, because that's not really, a general experience for most people. And taking that example of why are these people living together? Peter Goodwin and his wife Mary Cunningham had 6 children, 3 of whom survived infancy, 3 of whom died in infancy. And the 1900 census shows that 5 children had been born, 3 were living. In 1901, she gives birth to her 6th and final child, a son. He and the 3 surviving children all had birth certificates. The 3 surviving children, they don't identify first names. It's male, male, and female Goodwin in 1891, 96, and 98. And then in 1901, John James Goodwin was born, and he only lived till June, so he dies about 4 months of age, and he's buried a few months after his father. His father died the week after the baby was born. And then in 1903, 2.5 years later, the mother dies. So you have a 12, 7, and 5-year-old orphan family, and they have to go somewhere. And my aunt said that they were taken in by her mother's aunt. It was not their aunt. It was their my great-grandmother, who was their aunt by marriage. It was her sister. So she wasn't anything to them, but she was from the same town in Ireland that their late father was from, so she at least had some connection to them as a neighbor to their father. And then at some time, in the next few years, times became very tough, and the 12-year-old joined the Navy, and the 7-year-old became 14, and he was living with my grandmother and her family. And then his sister was sent, ironically, to Ireland. Even though she was an American-born child, she was sent to Ireland. So that was an interesting story to track down and find out. And sure enough, she's there in the 1911 census in Ireland. And in the 1930s, she comes back to the United States, and she's buried in the Calvary grave with her parents and her older brothers. So the leads do go, track it down, write it down, follow your paper trail. People were born. Is there a birth certificate? If they were Christian, do they practice infant baptism? Do you have the baptism? Did they get confirmed in their church? Did the church keep confirmation records? That's not going to tell you a lot, but at least it tells you what parish they were living in when the child was somewhere between 9 to 12, 13 years old. When they're buried, who are they buried with? Who purchased the grave? Most poor people are not going to buy a grave just because. You buy a grave because somebody's died and you need use of one right now. So that if a grave was purchased in February of 1893, somebody died. And in Peter and John Goodwin's case, they both had sons born in September of 1892, a few days apart, and they both died in February of 1893, about, I think it was 10 days apart. But they both purchased their grave, and they're not exactly next to each other, but they are in the same general area of Calvary Cemetery. It was $15 to purchase a grave in 1893. And apparently the custom back then was that the funeral service, the mortuary, they infants are generally buried the next day. Obviously, they didn't have friends, so there's not a wake service like an adult would have received. So, but I spoke with a funeral director, and he said the custom back then was that infants were not. There wasn't a charge for the funeral home to bury them. Now, there would be a charge, obviously, for the grave digger to open up the grave, etc. If you had a headstone, there's expenses in death, but they tried to keep it as humane as possible. I'm sure they were well compensated when an adult died, which clearly everybody, we're all going to die. That's not a newsflash. And the city directory does help you track, knowing, what jobs these people had. Were they a seamstress, a tailor, a wagon driver with, my Hell's Kitchen fellows, all 4 of them were quote unquote drivers, and they drove a truck, which back then was a wagon and a team. And don't forget about newspapers. If it bleeds, it leads. Hugh Goodwin There was a fire, and he lived, I believe it was 610 West 38th Street, and there was a fire, and he lost horses and such. So the parameters of Hell's Kitchen. I meant to start this 40 minutes ago when we started, but the area runs from 8th Avenue West to the river, and there was a 12th Avenue once upon a time. And then it runs north to south from West 34th Street north to West 59th Street. So that's a pretty good size of real estate. But again, genealogy, just like politics and real estate, location, location, location. You have to be looking in the right place to find the right documents. If you're in the wrong year, you're not going to find the record. If you're in the wrong location, if you're in the wrong parish, you're not going to find it. And that could be, you're 2-3 blocks away, or you're in the wrong Christian denomination. Your family may not have been Methodist; they were still Episcopalian, and that's why you're not finding the baptisms. But yeah, it's a challenge. Hell's Kitchen is depicted in some TV series, like Daredevil comic book has been made into a Netflix series a few years ago. So you get to get glimpses of, how it appears now, and, see cultural references to it. But it was definitely a very, congested, poor place. But there were other places in Manhattan on the east side where Stuyvesant Town is now. It was the gas house district. And apparently at one point in the 1800s, it had the highest infant mortality rate on the planet. And that was another place that Irish immigrants would move into. And the thing to remember is, it seems, for whatever reason, that the Irish moved in, they were either east side or west side. And if things got better, they moved up and stayed on the east side. So they'd move from East 14th Street to East 39th Street, or they'd move from West 34th Street to West 46th Street to West 59th Street to West 108th Street. But obviously there wasn't zoning or rules, but that's the things to keep in mind, especially with the city directory. Some people have unusual names. Some people have repetitive names. Like my ancestor's name, one of the reasons I've done genealogy over the years is my last name is Cassidy. And people would always ask, oh, I wonder if we're related. And I thought, well, we should know who we're related to. So now I do know that, my great-grandfather, came over. He had 2 brothers. One of them did live in Hell's Kitchen, Michael. He had 1 son, and he married in 1909, and he and his wife had 7 children between 1911 and 1929. His wife died in 1940. He died in 1958. And they have living descendants through several of their 6 surviving children. Their 7th child was short-lived. He lived about 2 years. He died in 1931. And, they wound up living, in other parts of the city. Very few, people, at least in my family research, stayed in Hell's Kitchen. If they died there, it was because they died relatively young. If they were able to move out, they did. And the Kathleen Goodwin, who had been sent to Ireland, when she came back, she and her oldest brother Owen lived in Hell's Kitchen when they died in 1950 and 1955. But he was separated from his wife. I don't think they were ever legally divorced, but he and his wife had 3 children. He's an example of one of the other reasons you may not be finding a wedding record is if you're looking in the church or in New York. Well, he didn't get married in New York, and he didn't get married in a church. And they lived in Philadelphia, so I looked there, and the archdiocesan archivist said, I don't find a record here, but we're not that far from Elkton, Maryland, and a lot of people went down there to elope. Well, surprisingly, sure enough, that's exactly what this gentleman did. So that's why there's no marriage notation. But he got married there in 1916, and then his daughters got married there in 1935 and 1936. They all eloped, and Maryland is another state where they do not name who the parents of the bride and groom are. So we're very fortunate in New York that the civil record has recorded that for a very long time, since at least as far back as 1866. And the other unusual things about New York, research, as I mentioned earlier, from 1866 to about 1888, there's two civil marriage records. Now, they're both collected by the same office, the Department of Health, but there's a certificate and then a ledger style entry. So the certificate was written by the priest, the minister, the rabbi, the judge, and then the ledger entry was written by the office clerk. So she or he may have had better handwriting, or their record book may have survived time better than the certificates, and therefore the image, when it was microfilmed, is crisper and clearer and easier to read. There may have been a fire and the certificate was destroyed, but the ledger entry survived, or vice versa. So if there is a duplicate record, you always want to look at it. Obviously, if they got married in a religious ceremony, did the minister keep his own records? You want to access those. Maybe there's notes in there, especially places of origin might be in the notes. Probably aren't, but you never know until you look. And for the handful of times that they're there, if it's one of your research questions, it'll be well worth your time that you ask that question. From 1908 to 1937, New York is late to the game with the marriage license. Bride and groom show up, they get married. After the marriage is over, then a certificate was created. Starting in 1908, they had to get permission, or prove that they were free to marry, so they get a license. So bride and groom go into the city clerk, fill out an affidavit. Then the affidavit was copied by the city clerk as a license, and then they were issued their license after I'm sure they paid a fee. And then a day or so later, they were able to get married by a priest, a minister, a rabbi, or they come back and get married in the city clerk office. But the Department of Health was still accepting the certificates. So for a lot of the marriages, you have a Department of Health marriage record. Those are the ones that are on Family Search, those parking lot angels through Facebook's New York City group, genealogy group. They're indexed. They're available through Family Search. SteveMorse.org has a searchable database to search that index. It takes you into transcriptions at Family Search. If you can get to a Family History Center, you can look at the actual scanned images of those Department of Health marriage records. But then there's also the city clerk marriage license, which does get a little bit more intrusive in the type of questions it asks. If they were divorced, it asks questions about the divorce. So divorce records were private for 100 years, but the nosy question, if they got remarried, were not, because only the innocent party was free to remarry in New York. The guilty party was not. So that's one of the reasons Elkton down in Maryland became so popular, is they didn't require a waiting period for the license, that bride and groom could show up and get married that day and not have to get a hotel room. So it was cheaper. If you went other places, you had to wait. And these people, like, for example, a divorced person couldn't get married in New York. So if they were coming down from New York, they wanted, they had to go somewhere where they could be there and back in a day and not have to, spend, days. So you get the details or the hints that it will tell you generally about when the person divorced and where. And then so those records are available through Municipal Archives through 1949. Currently, there's only a city clerk marriage record that, I'm sure the priests and the ministers and the rabbis are like, listen, I do not need to be recording these marriage details for the Department of Health, for the city clerk, filling all this stuff out and signing it and sending it. And then if you're a Catholic, have to send, proof of the marriage to the baptismal parish, after 1908, which would be that same time period that I'm sure they were just drowning in paperwork. But, for us as genealogists, it's terrific, because the more questions they were asked, the more papers that are created, the more leads we have, the more we find out. And unfortunately, not everything is perfect, but the more clues you get, the more pieces you have in the puzzle. I liken genealogy as a game of solitaire. You keep flipping cards so you get the red jack that you're looking for, and sometimes you keep you have the computer games, you keep having losing hands, and where the jack is, and you're like, all right, how do I get that card out of there? And then there must only be one or two ways to solve that hand, and then you finally get it. Well, genealogy, there's always the chance that once they're dead, they can't have any more children. But while they were living, did they have 5 children? Did they have 7 children? Did they have 12 children? Because if you're looking for a specific maiden name, for example, the more children a woman had, that's the more players that are going to get married, and hopefully not get married in Maryland or Arkansas or Missouri, where they're not going to be asked what's your mother's maiden name. Hopefully they got married in New York or New Jersey in 1901 or later, at least. I don't know about earlier than that. And they were asked, what was your mother's maiden name? But if your ancestor got married, say in Arkansas, but they had a sister that got eloped into New York City, she moved to New York City to become a Broadway actress, and she got married there. Well, there you go. You have that information. And yeah, no, we've been on about 51 minutes. It's just been the one person. So thank you, whoever you are, for hanging in there and watching. I apologize for the if you have any questions, I guess I'll stay on for a few more minutes, but I don't think I'm without some questions or some other direction. If I could pull up my slides, I could show some examples, or maybe get some train of thought. I guess the one train of thought with Catholic records, since most Irish immigrants were of Catholic extraction. Remember that in 1908, on April 19th, the new canon law went into effect on that Easter Sunday, and they were supposed to cross-reference back to the baptismal record. So if a baptized Catholic got married after that point, there's supposed to be in the Catholic Church, according to canon law, there should be a reference next to the baptismal entry saying, to whom they married, where and when. So say, for example, on April 20th, 1908, a 75-year-old lifelong Catholic got married for the first time or the 10th time. But if he got married in the Catholic Church, his baptismal entry, if he's 75, I can't do the math, but, back, 1840s or so, there might be a reference to his 1908 marriage. And then for a child who was born in 1908, when they came of age and get married, say in 1928, as a 20-year-old, it'll have a reference, where in 1928 and to whom did they marry. And if they married more than once, you get the subsequent marriage as well. Or if they took religious vows and became a sister, or were ordained and became a deacon on their way to the priesthood. But that's a good way, especially if you have an Irish immigrant. That's probably one of the easiest ways. Now, again, it only works for people who married, in the Catholic Church and it was properly recorded 1908 and later. But, not everybody came over in the potato famine. Not everybody came over before the revolution. So, again, your genealogy is your genealogy. Work from knowns to unknowns, search your family tree and see. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that there were connections between Irish generations, that they did, learn to read and write over here and would send letters back. Now, I don't know, if a literate person here was writing to an illiterate person there, maybe they sent it care of the priest, and the priest would, pull you aside on Sunday. Hey, your sister sent you a letter. Come into the rectory this week and I'll read it to you. And then, he'd give, they probably sent some money, and he'd give them the money, and then he'd read the letter. But they did keep in touch. For example, Kathleen Goodwin, when she was sent to Ireland, her oldest cousin from her Uncle John had been left in Ireland. The idea is they were going to go back. Well, John died 7 years in, so they didn't go back, but their son didn't die. He grew up, And Kathleen and he were raised by aunts and uncles that 3 aunts and uncles that had never married, and an uncle who married, but his marriage was very short-lived. Tragically, his new wife and her son from her previous marriage, where she was widowed from, they died in a fire. The house burned down, and there was an inquest, and it was written about in the paper. And tragically, the little boy and his mother died. So you had 2 men and 2 women that were siblings that raised their nephew, and then finished raising their niece, who was sent over from the United States. And then after a few years, the nephew got married and had a son. And then his cousin never married. And then one by one, the aunts and uncles died off. And when the final uncle died in 1933, she decided, I never married. I want to go home to America. So she didn't have a passport to get into the United Kingdom. At that time, she didn't need it. And before World War II, she technically didn't need one to travel. But as an American, saying she was an American, trying to go into a new country, she did, go through the State Department and get a passport issued. So it had her father's naturalization papers in the application, his death certificate, her birth and baptismal certificate to prove that she really was his daughter, had her photograph. So it was very interesting. And then you're able to find her on the UK outgoing list. You're able to find her on the list coming into New York City in 1935. She's going to visit her younger of her 2 older brothers, Thomas, who lived in Richmond Hill. And that's where she went initially. And then she's the one that finds her way back into Hell's Kitchen. She and the older brother, die there. So piecing, bit by bit, she does appear in Irish records as well as American records. Her oldest cousin appears in American records, ironically, because he's in both the 1900 federal census and the 1905 state census as living in New York, but he didn't. He doesn't come over to New York until 1909, and he stays there for about 11 months, ironically. So he was in America for the 1910 census, but he's not in that one. So the one where he actually lived in America, he's not in the census. But I'm able to get information about him in the 1900 U.S. Census, the 1901 Irish Census, the 1905 New York State Census, and the 1911 Irish Census. And then in 1939, he filed for the rations books as the United Kingdom entered World War I. They had rations, so it's not a census, so it doesn't have the privacy restrictions of 100 years. 72 in America, but 100 over in the UK and Ireland. And but it gives his name and date of birth, his wife's name and date of birth, their son. So it's interesting to track people. He was a temporary Hell's Kitchen resident, and that's the some ideas on how to search Hell's Kitchen. And I hope that the book list will stay in the descriptor. And I thank you, whoever you are, for watching. And I've seen other people do it. It's certainly more work needs to be done to do this properly, but I'm not going to get any better until I start trying to do it kind of like your genealogy. You're not going to find great-great-grandma's maiden name until you write letters, look at census records, look at vital records, go to the cemetery, go to the town. She's not going to come find you. She's been dead for years, but you can go find out more about her if you do the work. If you want to lose weight, it's not going to happen unless you start eating better and exercising, preferably both. And you do it little by little, the results come in. So hopefully, if I, decide to keep pursuing this, I can, come up with, what software would allow me to, have some questions and answers with, I know that over here on the side here, people could have typed questions, I believe, and if I'm incorrect, I will learn. But to have split screens and then to be able to post screenshots and other things. But Thank you very much for tuning in. If everyone have a happy Father's Day and a happy Independence Day a few weeks later, and enjoy the weekend. So I'm going to sign off now a half hour early. And again, thank you very much. Have a good night.